Hi, you're watching Video 101 and I'm John Crossman. Thanks for watching. Today we're continuing our discussion about characteristics of effective video editors in the technical aspect. And number 2 is knowing the basics of video. So I've broken this into 3 subcategories: codecs, frame size, and frame rate. These are important to know because your content is shot at a certain, uses these parameters. You're going to edit using these parameters, and it's going to be displayed back at your final location using these parameters. So it's important to at least understand these basics. So the first is codecs. Well, it was explained to me by a broadcast engineer that a codec is basically an envelope that contains all the information about the video that you're shooting. Frame rate, frame size, color temperature, time code, how the picture was compressed, what algorithms are being used, what size are the compression blocks, all this kind of stuff. And then, of course, audio. How is the audio captured? What sample rate was it captured at? Is it mono? Is it stereo? Is it something else? I have an HD camera that will record in 5.1 surround sound, but why would I want to do that? Because that's pretty hard to use when you edit. So all of that information, including metadata and other stuff, is all what the codec is. So when I shoot with this camera, it's a Sony camera, it gives me a .mxf file. Well, when I open this in Premiere, there are at least half a dozen, maybe more, codecs that are Sony XD-Cam codecs. And so I find the one that matches the one that I shot with, which I have, and that's how I create my timeline using that codec. That'll mean that this video will play back in real time, doesn't need a lot of processing. The computer knows what to use to play it back for me, and it's low usage of the processor. If I pick some, if you use an Avid editor, when you bring in your footage, no matter what it is, it'll convert it to their DNX codec, which is just the way, again, the footage is organized from a technical standpoint. And they basically only use their codec to edit with. And so whatever you put into an Avid, it's going to change it. It's going to not recompress it, but it's going to reprocess it into that envelope, into that wrapper, so that the editor doesn't have to read 20 different codecs. It only reads its own codec, and it makes everything fit into it. So that's a brief explanation about codecs. Next is frame size. The first 50 years of television, there was only television, and it was 720 by 480. And when you hear these numbers, we're talking about number of pixels across the screen and number of pixels top to bottom. So 720 by 480 is 720 across, 480 up and down. In 2006, the FCC mandated that broadcasters switch to HD content. 2 things happened with HD. One, the frame changed size. A full frame HD is 1920 across by 1080 up and down, okay? But what also changed is standard def was 4 by 3 and HD is 16 by 9. 16 by 9 was chosen because it has a more cinematic look, and they wanted, as long as they were screwing around with things, they wanted to choose a different frame aspect ratio so that it would be more compatible with movie content and other content out there that they wanted to be able to broadcast. So there were 2 major things. Well, 2006 rolled around and the broadcasters weren't ready because it required a lot of investment to convert from standard def. You have to remember that every episode of MASH, every episode of Friends, every episode of All in the Family was all shot in standard def. And so for a station to now broadcast those reruns, the distributor is not going to go back and, wave a magic wand and make all that content HD. It's just not possible. So it has to be actually up-res to HD when it's broadcast. Well, you're talking about a lot of hardware, a lot of math going on, and of course broadcast is real time, so you're going to pay a premium to get that kind of processing, which they all did because it was all new at the time, a new technology, and had been mandated, and so it took a couple of years. It might have been 2009 when they finally let them turn off the standard def broadcast, but for several years you had dual broadcasts. You had a digital broadcast that was HD, and you had an analog broadcast which was standard def. And even to this day, you'll see local news, especially as the easiest place to see it. The graphical information and the shot is still composed as if people are watching it in 4:3, because there are a handful of people out there in the market that still are using a set-top converter box, but their TV isn't 16:9. So they're either watching it still in 4:3, and so in order to see all the temperatures on the weather map, it's got to be in that 4:3 frame, or they watch it with a bar on the top and on the bottom of the screen, which most people don't like, so because it makes your small TV even smaller. So there's still, I guess, people out there that are doing it. I can't imagine that there's too many really left, and I don't know how long they're going to keep. A website is responsive, so if it knows that you're using the whole screen, it'll spread stuff out. If you're not, it'll tuck stuff in, but broadcast doesn't have that capability, so we'll see what happens with that. So that was HD. Now there were other things going on with HD, so that's 1920, 1080. But you may be aware of, there's a lot of content on YouTube that's actually played back at 1280, 720. So that's kind of an intermediate, still considered HD, and at the time it was considered HD. And if you went out in 2006 and were going to buy an HD TV and didn't know the difference, chances are you would have bought a 720p television, because it was still considered HD, but it wasn't truly full frame HD. Now we're into the 4K space, and the same thing has happened. Costco is full of TVs that are called Ultra HD, and that's a nice way of saying they're 4K, but they're really not. They're really 3840 by 2160. Again, we're talking pixels across and up and down. And you'd say, well, it says it's 4K. Isn't that 4,000? A true 4K signal, because of the math with processors and the binary systems that we have, is actually 4,096 pixels across by 2180 top to bottom. So the top to bottom is the same, and that's where our eyes perceive the resolution is, in the top to the bottom, not to the side to side. So there's science behind this. One of the challenges of 4K is it's roughly 10 times the information of a HD picture. And so it takes a lot more storage, takes a lot more bandwidth and processing to watch 4K and to shoot 4K and all that other stuff. And so one way that they kind of cheat that is by, instead of shooting 4,000 or 4,096 frame, they actually shoot a 3840 screen, but they shoot it with rectangular pixels instead of square pixels, which is whenever you set up aspect ratios, usually given the choice between some anamorphic things, square or square pixels. And in this world, in progressive land now, everything is square pixels. Well, they can save space and save streaming and save, all comes down to space and time and money, by actually shooting an image but squeezing the pixels a little bit, and then when it hits a 4K television, it sees that and goes, oh, this is supposed to be 4K, so it stretches it out, turning all those pixels back into squares. Every once in a while, it's pretty rare now, but when all this was changing, sometimes you would bring in footage and it would be, squozen on your timeline because it was shot, say, anamorphically in a camera that supported that format, and now you're playing it back on a regular timeline that's not compensating for the anamorphic in the codec, and so the picture looks squished. Well, it's the same kind of idea with the Ultra HD versus the true, the Ultra HD versus the true 4K, in that they can save some space and time and processing by making the pixels a different shape, and then when they're displayed, they're stretched back out to be square, and nobody knows the difference. There was some of that in the HD too. A lot of the early HD formats were actually captured 1,440 pixels by 1080. But if the codec is correct, it will stretch that out to 1920, 1080, and your eye can't see the difference. It's the same information. So that's frame sizes. Okay, so there's a lot of difference. And again, the point of knowing what you're working with is just if you can match your editing codec to what the camera shot, then it's a lighter load on your processor. The third thing we're going to talk about is actually frame rates. Now, film has traditionally been shot since the 1920s at 24 frames per second. There's a good book here called The History of Editing, or Timeline, I think it's called, by John Buck. And that explains kind of how this was all decided. And it's interesting. I'm not going to go into it here. You can get it on Amazon or a Kindle book like I have it. Very technical read, but it was interesting to me because it really covers a lot of the big change that I've seen throughout my career. And so film is at 24. So with film being shot at 24 frames a second, when it was broadcast at 30 frames a second, well, it would have come across as being sped up because you're now have 30 frames of broadcast time, filling it with 24 frames, and so the film is going to be done before the second is done. So they do a process called pull down, and what that does is it extrapolates between the 24 frame that film is and the 30 frame that broadcast is, and adds in some extra frames, basically by doubling certain frames. Again, imperceptible to your eye, but that's what allows you to play back a 24 frame source in a 30 frame world. Okay. Similarly, if you're shooting a film and you want to show an actor in front of a TV, all of that video is going to have to go through the reverse pull down process to actually take some frames out so that it doesn't flicker and it stays in sync with the film. Either that or they put it in after the fact. But back in the day, if they were going to do that, which they don't do a lot because it was expensive to do, they'd actually have to process the video that was playing back on the TV in such a way that it would match the 24 frames. Now, that being said, you might go, well, I look at my timeline and it's 29.97 frames a second. It's not 30 frames a second. And this is true. And that 29.97 comes from the math that's involved. It's ratios between that have to do with broadcasting video. Doesn't have anything to do with the internet or watching it on your phone or anything else. But broadcast is the primary distribution method for video, and broadcasting is basically mapping a video signal over a radio signal, and so that's where they came up with these odd frame things. Now today, with digital broadcasting, I don't know that is still really a factor, but I do believe that it's still broadcast at 29.97. Again, probably for those handful of people that haven't upgraded their TV sets yet. If it wasn't, then all of the 30 frame a second would look slightly off, along with the other footage. So a lot of that processing now is just digital and built into the system, but there are different frame rates. So there's actually a 23.95, I think, which is a relationship to the 29.97. It's easier math rather than doing the pull down for 24 frames to 29.97. If you shoot at 23 point whatever it is, 95 or 97, then it's a straight drop down math kind of thing. And then there's cameras that shoot 30 frames a second. So the difference between 23.97, 24, 29.97, and 30 all get taken care of when it's broadcast, and it's broadcast out at that 30 frames a second. If you see a camera that claims it's 60 frames a second, in reality it isn't, but what it is it's taking 2 samples of the image of what it's looking at every second and putting that into a 30 frame playback. If you were really shooting 60 full frames a second, then it would play back at half the speed of normal, because you're taking twice as many frames and playing it back in over 30 frames. Playback on the internet, playback on broadcast, playback on your phone is typically going to be 30 frames a second. If it isn't, or if your footage is not resolved to that playback speed, then it's either going to look too fast or too slow. Frame rates are important just because it's part of the information in a codec. You don't want your computer to have to be doing a pull down of all your footage just to be able to edit it in time. And so codecs, frame size, and frame rates are really the basics that you need to understand about the video that you're trying to either shoot or edit. And certainly certain clients will have specific specs that they want you to hit. I just finished a project where they wanted it shot in 4K. I don't think they knew why they wanted it shot in 4K, because they would have gotten the same look in HD. The cameras can shoot either 4K or HD, and they're playing it back totally on the internet, which most people would much rather pay for the data of a standard def or even a HD downstream than they would for a 4K stream. So I'm not quite sure what their idea was, but that was the buzzword, is the buzzword of the time. Stand by, because 8K is coming. Depending on your point of view, I mean, it's great that we have this technology, but at the end of the day, it still has to work in the real world and create value. And the value that 8K brings versus the value that HD does, and the cost of it is, everyone has to make up their own mind. To me, at this point, there really is no point in investing in the infrastructure that you would need to support 8K when the vast majority of people would never get the benefit of it. So anyway, those are the video basics: codecs, frame size, and frame rate. I'm John Crossman. You're watching Video 101. Thanks for watching.